Hey, I'm Nate Savage. In this lesson, I'm going to teach you 8 guitar chords that you must know if you're a guitar player. Now, if you already know these chords, that's fine, but you stick around. I'm going to be giving some tips on making your chords sound great and clean, and your chord transition sound smooth too. Now, I believe it was the great Chet Atkins that said, "I never made a dime above 5." And he was referring to the 5th fret on that. And one of the things he was talking about when he said that was open chords. He was referring to open chords. And Chet Atkins, being the virtuoso that he was, him saying that I never made a dime above 5 is awesome, because it should tell you the importance of these open chords that we're going to learn in this lesson. They're really important for your career as a guitarist. The 8 chords we're going to be tackling in this lesson are G major, C major, D major, F major, E major, A major, E minor, and A minor. You may be saying, "Nate, that's a lot of chords. There's no way I can remember this in one lesson." Don't worry about that. Space these out over a few weeks or even a few months. Take them at your own pace. So let's get started with a G major chord. Bring your hand up to the guitar and pretend like you're holding an apple or something. That's a good posture to think about when you're making chords. Come put your thumb on the back of the neck right there and just relax. Make sure to relax while you're doing all these. You shouldn't have a lot of excess tension in your hand. Now, when you're making this G major chord, you can either use the first, second, and third fingers, or you can use the second, third, and fourth fingers. I would really encourage you to use the second, third, and fourth fingers. I'll show you later why, but for now, try it with the second, third, and fourth. If it's too hard for you for right now, you can use the first, second, and third. Okay, come and put your third finger on the 3rd fret of the low E string, and you want to notice a couple of things. I'm coming right down on the very tip of my finger. I'm not being lazy and letting my finger hang over like this. That's a really important part of making chords. You want to come right down on the very tip of your finger. You also want to notice that my finger is right behind the fret wire right here. So those two things, come down on the very tip of your finger and try to come right behind the frets too. So that's your first note. Second note, second finger on the 2nd fret of the A string right there. Again, very tip of your finger. Now your pinky is going to come grab the 3rd fret of the high E string, right behind the fret, right on the tip of your finger. Strum all 6 strings. And like I said, you can make this with your first, second, and third fingers if that's too hard for you. But I would really encourage you to use your second, third, and fourth fingers. All right, let's move on to the C major chord. And one tip I want to give you here is don't kink your wrist too far this way when you're making chords. That can hurt after a while. So, I mean, my wrist isn't going to be perfectly straight. It's going to be a little bit bent, but don't kink it too far. Otherwise, it might start hurting you. So let's learn the C major chord. This is a great chord to let you know if you're coming down on the very tips of your fingers, and I'll show you why. Put your 3rd finger on the 3rd fret of the 5th string, right behind the fret. 2nd finger, 2nd fret of the D string, and your 1st finger on the 1st fret of the B string. And now leave the low E string out and just strum the top 5 strings. Now, that sounded good, right? There were clear notes, no buzzing. Now watch as I just barely adjust my posture on my fingers, and don't come down right on the very tips of them. Listen to this now. Almost all the notes in the chord disappeared, so that is a great chord for telling you if you're working on coming down on the tips of your fingers really good or not. The reason I wanted you to make your G chord with your 2nd, 3rd, and 4th fingers is this right here. You're going to be switching between a G and a C chord a lot when you play guitar. And watch this change right here. Here's your C. I'm going to go right to a G. Not that big of a change if I use my 2nd, 3rd, and 4th fingers. If I use my 1st, 2nd, and 3rd fingers, I have a big change that has to take place. It's a lot harder to make that switch. All right, the next chord on the list is a D major chord, and I have a couple of tips for you on this one too for making your chord sound good. First of all, cut your fingernails. If you keep your fingernails short, it's a lot easier to come down directly on your fingertips. Now, a lot of people have trouble memorizing chords too, so let's learn this D chord, and then I'll teach you a couple of tips for memorizing chords. Put your 1st finger on the 2nd fret of the G string, 3rd finger on the 3rd fret of the B string, and your second finger on the second fret of the high E string. Leave the E and the A strings, the lowest two strings, out and just strum the top four strings. And you'll notice my fingers aren't coming directly perpendicular to the strings. They're kind of off at an angle here. That's one thing that kind of helps get your fingers in that kind of tight little space that you have to make for this D chord. All right, let's talk about memorizing guitar chord shapes. Two things that you can do to help you memorize stuff faster, shapes faster, is to actually look at the chord and memorize what that chord looks like. A lot of you are probably going to be looking at chord diagrams on paper or on a computer screen, right? And you can visualize it like that, but looking at the chord, actually looking at it, memorizing what it looks like, is a great way to help you remember that chord. Also, you know what? Put that chord on and don't look at it at all. Just think about the way it feels and try to memorize the way it feels. The more ways you can attack memorizing something, the better chance you're going to have at remembering it. The next chord we're going to learn is an F major chord, and people get kind of scared when they hear F major chord because most beginners usually learn an F as a bar chord, but this F I'm going to teach you is a lot easier. It's only a 3-note chord, so you shouldn't have too hard of a time with it. Put your third finger on the third fret of the D string, second finger on the second fret of the G string, and your first finger is going to go on the first fret of the B string. And those are the only 3 notes that you're going to play, the D, G, and B strings. The next chord we're going to learn is an E major chord, and I'm going to go through some tips with you on this chord about making your chord transitions smooth. I get a lot of people emailing me, Nate, my chord transitions are just terrible. What's the problem here? Well, a lot of times people will try to start transitioning between chords before they actually have the chord that they're working on learned properly. So let's learn this E major chord, and I'm going to give you some tips for really solidifying chord shapes in your head. So put your second finger on the second fret of the A string, third finger on the second fret of the D string, and your first finger is going to come grab the first fret of the G string. Make sure you're coming right down on your fingertips, and make sure you're getting as close to the fret as you can there. Strum all 6 strings. Now, like I said, people will try to make chord transitions before they have chords learned really well, and that just kind of compounds the challenge, as it were. So what you want to do is make sure you have a chord learned really well before you try to transition between that chord and another chord. One way you can do that is to put the chord on, leave it there for a good 30 seconds, longer than I'm going to leave it here in this video. Then take it off, shake your hand completely out, put it back on, and just repeat that over and over again. It may take a few days or a week or even a couple of weeks, but as soon as you can get to that chord right away, then you're ready to start working on transitioning between that chord and another chord. Which leads us to the next chord we're going to learn. Let's work on an A major chord. Put your first finger on the second fret of the D string, second finger on the second fret of the G string, and your third finger on the second fret of the B string. This one's a little challenging because you have to scrunch your fingers up so close together all on that one fret, that second fret. Leave the low E string out and strum the top 5 strings. And we're kind of breaking a rule here because our index finger is not right behind the fret, but that can't really be helped because we have to scrunch our fingers up in such a small area. So once you get this chord down, do that same process. Put it on, leave it there, take it off, shake it all the way out. And then once you have that chord where you can go right to it, you can work on switching between that chord and another one. For example, switching between your E and your A chords is pretty common. So that's a change that you might want to work on. All right, that brings us to our 2 minor chords that we're going to learn. And they're pretty easy because we only have to switch one note or change one note from their major counterparts. So, for example, if you have your E major chord that we just learned, all you have to do to make that E major chord into an E minor chord is change one note, and it's the note that's on your index finger. Just take that off, and now you have an E minor chord. You can strum all 6 strings. All right, the last chord that I wanted to show you is an A minor chord. And this one is kind of cool because it feels just like an E major chord, only it's moved over a string set. I'll show you what I mean. Put your second finger on the second fret of the D string, third finger on the second fret of the G string, and your first finger on the first fret of the B string. Now strum all 5 strings and leave the low E string out. You see how this chord looks exactly like an E major shape, only you're moved over 1 string set there. So those are some of the most important chords that you're going to learn as a guitarist. And of course, bar chords and power chords are really important too, but these guys, these open chords, are really your money makers. Now, as you go through and work on these chords, remember to apply all the tips I gave you about making clean sounding chords and making your chord transition smooth too. That's really important. Thanks for watching, everyone. I just launched a new guitar lesson series and you can get it for free right now. Just go to guitarsystem.com/free-series. I'll see you there.